you can maybe refine this point. But I feel like if you hold to divine simplicity, I I would say everything it says about God in the Bible must be read about in a metaphor, right? Anything he does in time, right? Creation, anything that he does, it's like, well, he doesn't actually do it that way, right? We have to, you read it through this lens of he's this pure actuality. And, that's so anything he says, like, we assume God's doing this, but in a different way than actually tells us how he is.
Yeah, this is a good point, and a lot of classical theists will not admit it. Only a few will. So a lot of people will say, well, there's analogy and there's some metaphor and there's some like accommodative language where God's just kind of speaking in a way that you can understand. So John Calvin has this phrase. He says, God presents himself to us not as he is in himself, but as we want to see him. And I'm like, as I want to see him? That's not a great revelation. There's lots of things I would like to see them, but when I look at God, I'm like, I don't like that. You're going to forgive everyone? Don't forgive that person over there. He was horrible. Like
Yeah.
if it was because of what I want to see, we got a problem here. Um, but
Especially if we're all reprobate, right? If you take the Calvinist. Yeah.
right, exactly. Right. So it seems like there's a very serious problem here, something that makes communication impossible between God and creatures. And I'm like, that's a problem. But when you see a lot of this stuff kind of being thrown around, no one wants to like just really go through and like see how deeply all this metaphor and accommodation goes. Whereas I think if you start pushing it, you get to this claim where it's like, I don't know what's left of any of the sacred scriptures, any tradition you look at, doesn't matter. If you really go with this view, you're like, you got to make a lot of stuff metaphorical. And a metaphor for what is the big question? Because metaphors are supposed to point towards a literal reality. If all the metaphors are about God changing and God getting sad sometimes, and you're like, well, he's the exact opposite of that. I'm like, well, then these are the worst metaphors you could possibly pick. Um, now there are a small number of people who will just be like, yeah, all theology is metaphor. So Anthony Kinney has a paper that was published, oh gosh, maybe 10 or 12 years ago now, and I think it's just called Theology as Metaphor. And he just goes, well, we know God is timeless and immutable and simple and all this. I'm like, do we know that? Okay, I don't know, but he's like, we know that. I'm like, okay, and he's like, so therefore, when we talk about God's actions or God's this or God that, it's all metaphor. And I'm like, so all language about God is a metaphor, is what he says. Here's the problem with that: all language about God is metaphor. When I say God is simple, is that a metaphor? When I say God is timeless, is that a metaphor? I don't know what it's a metaphor for. At some point, it sounds like we're saying metaphors for metaphors, and I'm just like metaphorically metaphor. I don't know. I lose my grasp on the meaning of metaphor very fast if this is the claim.
No, I like that. I like that. I'm glad that we agree on that because I was just like, yeah, I mean, the if you like, I just couldn't understand how people could hold that view and just read the Bible and not see it. And my favorite thing is they do find the proof text of, well, you know, I do not change, right? I'm God and I don't change. And then usually every time I've seen that, it's about God's not changing so you can confide in him, you can trust in him, you can believe his promises, right? He's worthy, he's someone you can hold on because they're a firm foundation,
Yeah,
not an ontological, hey, by the way, I'm pure actuality. And you can't say that I change because if you do, then you're denying exactly who I am in my essence. You know what I mean?
yeah,
It's they put a whole lot of weight on these proof texts, and then especially for Latter-day Saints, we apparently get called out for having our own proof texts, which are kind of more clear than just reading the whole Bible as a metaphor to get the simple God,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Because I think when you're coming to Scripture with simplicity, like you have to make a lot of stuff metaphorical that doesn't seem like it should be. And when you're looking at these change passages, what's ridiculous is the verse right there says, "Well, I'm not a man who changes his mind, so when I make a promise, I'm going to keep it." Like I'm not a liar, and I'm like, okay, so it tells me the exact sense in which God does not change. It's not like this
Exactly.
big no change whatsoever kind of grand sweeping claim like you see in Augustine or something. It's it tells you what sense God does not change. And then when you look at Hosea, it's like, well, because I'm not a man, I will change. And you're like, oh, why? Well, stubborn men, they want wrath. They're angry. They're not going to change their plan of wrath to a plan for of forgiveness because they lack compassion. Well, I'm not a stubborn man who lacks compassion, so I will change my plan of wrath to a plan of forgiveness. You're like, oh, okay. So it tells you in what sense God
Mhm.
changes and does not change.